into that fun part of 2 Corinthians that can be a challenge to each and every one of us as we consider what God has in store for us as far as all that He has done for us, as we've just heard sung to us. We owe everything to Him. That's foundational to everything that's going to be shared in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And we want to make sure that we pay close attention to what God is saying to us and make sure that we are very careful to hear His word and understand His way for us and to live our lives in connection to all that He's done for us. Now, it's been a couple of weeks since we've been together. I've been gone for 3 Sundays. You missed one while I was gone. Seems like every time I go to the Philippines, there's a cancellation of a service. But we've been away from the book of 2 Corinthians for a number of weeks. And all that we've talked about over the last several months as we've been working our way through 2 Corinthians can really be boiled down to this. It can be boiled down to the significance and challenge of ministry. And in chapters 1 through 7, he's been talking about having integrity in ministry. Paul's been up against a lot of opposition, and he's gone to great lengths to give us a clear picture of what we can expect when we, as followers of Jesus Christ, surrender our lives to follow Him in obedience and to live out the reality of ministry in our lives. And so Paul's given us a clear picture. It's very balanced. He expresses his enthusiasm for the work that God has given him, but he's also made it very clear that it can be difficult and there can be great hardship. And Paul has led by example, even in the way he has dealt with some of the strains and stresses on his relationship with the Corinthian believers that were caused by these malicious false teachers who had crept in and who were seeking to destroy Paul's ministry, so to speak, and to discredit him as an individual. And Paul's shown us by example how we are to go about living in times where we're experiencing opposition, and how do we operate with integrity. Now, Paul's going to continue that theme of integrity, but he's going to turn to a different subject, a different aspect of what it means to have integrity in ministry that the Corinthian believers needed to be challenged on, and I think we need to be challenged on. Over and over again, we need to be challenged. And it's a subject that we don't like to talk about very much, and it's unfortunate, though. It's a subject that those on the outside say that's all we ever talk about. And so we want to make sure that we deal honestly and openly with the text. We don't run away from it. There's truth here for us to glean. And Paul wants to challenge the Corinthian believers and us as well. He's alluded to the collection for the saints in Jerusalem back in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians. You might remember when we dealt with that passage. And in that passage, it gives certain guidelines that need to be taken on by the church to ensure that everything is done decently in order. And Paul's collecting this gift for the believers back in Jerusalem who have experienced great hardship through persecution, through famine, and through their willingness to give to the ministry. That when Pentecost happened and 3,000 were added, people stayed there in Jerusalem. And we were told in Acts chapter 2 that they had all things common. And we even have the example of Barnabas, who was willing to sell of his wealth that he had in order to take care of the needs that the ministry, as it was growing, was incurring. And then we have that tragic example in Acts chapter 5 where Ananias and Sapphira, they wanted to give to the cause, but then they lied about their gift, and they were struck dead. And so we have this ministry that was exploding in Jerusalem, and the believers in that area took care of people, and then they went through persecution, and then they had famine, and so they were under great hardship. So Paul's going around to all the churches who really are a direct result of the ministry of the Jerusalem church, who sent out missionaries all around. He's going around collecting. And he talked to them about it in Corinth, and the Corinthian church agreed that they would give a gift, but they haven't done so. And so now 2 Corinthians, Paul's writing to remind them of their responsibility. And so what he alluded to in chapter 16, he really brings to the forefront in chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians. And the Corinthian church, for all intents and purposes, was a fairly wealthy church. And they had the ability to contribute in some significant ways. And so they were a big part of what Paul was doing. But they had not followed through on their commitment at this point. And Paul is writing them again to remind them of their commitment and their responsibility to the Lord. So in chapters 8 and 9, Paul will be challenging them to live with integrity in supporting the work of God financially. And as a result of all of that, he's going to teach us some great principles as well. And Paul begins this important section in the passage that we're going to look at this morning in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 8. He begins this important section of the book with an illustration of the churches from Macedonia. And unlike the Corinthian church, the churches in Macedonia were experiencing great hardship and in utter poverty. And so Paul uses them as an example. This group of poor churches, he uses that as an example to a very affluent church. Now, I don't think that Paul was doing that to guilt them into giving more or to give it all. But I think he wants to illustrate a very important principle that lies under everything that Paul is saying. And it's this important principle of giving that we need to understand. And let me put it this way for you. Our giving is not an obligation or a burden to bear. It is a spiritual matter of the heart that is a direct result of the work of grace of God. And that's what Paul wants them to understand. He uses them, the Macedonians, as an example, as we'll see why in just a moment. He uses them. God's work of grace in the Macedonians enabled them to be able to give in ways that were not humanly possible or thought humanly possible. And he wants the Corinthians to understand that same work of grace that brought this very poor group of churches to be able to give is the same work of grace that is needed in you. So I don't think he's trying to guilt them in any way. And I have no desire during these next few weeks to guilt anybody about that, because it is a matter of the heart that God wants to deal with. And it's a result, our ability to give is a result of God's work of grace in our lives. In other words, what Paul's saying is that God's not so much interested, and neither is Paul, in the amount to be given. That's not what Paul's really worried about. That's not his concern. But he's concerned is that we understand that biblical giving is a matter of grace. God's enablement. So let me put it this way. Once we understand the principle of grace, it changes our whole perspective of giving. I believe that with all my heart. I believe that once we understand the work of God's grace in our lives and God's enablement of grace in our lives, it changes the whole perspective that we have on giving. Now, as I said, some don't like to hear it. If you're visiting here today and you're going like, oh boy, here we go again, another church talking about money. I really don't want to talk so much about money, but I have to in one sense because it comes up in the text. But that's not the point of the text. The point of the text is that our giving is to be an act of of worship because of God's grace that's been evident in our lives. And so once we understand this principle of grace, it just changes everything. Now, what we have to understand is that the Corinthians, just like us, struggle with this giving thing. Paul had talked to them about it. They had said, yes, we'll do that. They had yet to do it. Paul's written them, this may be his third, maybe a fourth letter. I have no doubt that he probably, in some of the other letters that we don't have record of, he probably mentioned it again. And their intentions were good, but their follow-through was a little weak. And so Paul, I don't think he's trying to guilt them in any way, but they're struggling. They're struggling with this whole idea of giving, just like we do. Now, I want to do something here that perhaps will make some of us uncomfortable, but I'm going to do it anyway, okay? I'm just blame it on jet lag if you don't like it, all right? It's almost 10 o'clock at night, my mind, okay? So if you don't like it, don't worry about it. But I'm going to ask everybody to stand right now. I'm going to ask you to stand, all right? See, that feels good, doesn't it? That wasn't hard. That wasn't hard. And I'm not going to make you stand for the whole sermon like I do, okay? I'm going to let you sit down in just a moment, but I'm going to do it in a way that's going to illustrate a point. Now, let me make a couple of clarifications here so that I don't get myself in too much trouble. What I'm about ready to share it with you is just statistics done in a different way, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you statistics of our church, right, of how our struggle is. And as we think about this, I want you to have this visual in your mind, okay? And so we have things called giving units, and that's very technical, business-like, but a giving unit represents somebody who has given regularly to the church, okay? And you've got a name and a number, and every year around tax time, which we're getting very close, that we send you out a letter that lets you know how much you've given, okay? And so when I start talking about these numbers, I have no idea what any of you give, none whatsoever. Okay? Nor do I want to know, unless you tell me. I have no idea. So all I'm doing is using reports that are given to me as information on how things are going and what we're doing. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to ask this whole section over here. I want you all to sit down, all of you, sit down. And all of you in that back section, you may sit down as well. All of you back there, all right? Yeah. Everybody that just sat down, that represents about 25% of what we have here, okay? That 25% over the last 3 months. Now, again, don't take offense. None of you, I have no idea what you guys have done as far as giving, okay? So I didn't pick on you as being, oh, this is the bad side. I sit on this side, so we're all friends, okay? All right. I should have chose that side over there because they hardly ever can't get at me, all right? But nonetheless, this 25% represents the number of giving units or people that are supposedly regular attenders, regular members, or those who are supposedly regular givers. 25% gave 0 to the ministry of Calvary Bible Church over the last 3 months. Now look around. Yeah, it's all your fault. Yes, good idea. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do now is this group, you can sit down all the way back. Yeah, you guys aren't in as bad a shape as that group over there. Oh. And all of you can sit down. Yeah. And this first section right here, you guys can sit down. Dio, you get to stay in the good group, so you can start relaxing, okay? All those that I just sit down, that represents about 60% of our congregation, 63%. And this group has contributed quite a bit to the ministry here. And we're thankful for all those because we recognize that some in this group over here that gave 0, there's a lot of reasons for that to happen. A lot of reasons. So again, it's not the issue of guilt. I'm just wanting you to understand. But this group gave about 46% of what's been given in the last 3 months. 46%, that's pretty good. Now, all of you guys can sit down. All of you guys up here can sit down. All of you in the back can sit down. We have some undesignated giving, and we only have about 200 giving units, and we probably have 300-400 people here. But this represents the bulk. You guys are the real givers, as we would say, okay? It's a bad phrase, okay? But this represents 25%. 25% of our church body gave 51% of the giving over the last 3 months. Now I'm going to ask all of you, this row, this row, this row. This represents about 13% of our congregation. which gave 1/3 of all the money that's been given over the last 3 months. So now when you look around, 1/3, 51% is given from this group. The rest is given by the others. Do you see a problem? And again, I'm not here, you guys can sit down now. I'm not here to guilt anybody. I'm just trying to say, just like they did in Corinth, we do here. We struggle with it. I love what Dave Ramsey has said. Dave Ramsey says that the reason why people struggle to give is because they're in debt. It's not that they don't want to. The average believer really wants to. But they haven't structured their lives in ways that they're able to. And so as we've looked around, we realize that we have a small portion that is carrying a large portion of the ministry here. And we have a large portion that is helping out some hardly at all, some none at all. But it just illustrates the fact that we as Christians in this day and age struggle with the follow-through as well. There's hardly a believer in here who's known the Lord and who's been coming to church for a while. There's hardly a believer in here that doesn't know that you're supposed to give something to the Lord. And you know what the Scripture says. But we still struggle with it. And sometimes it's because we're in situations where we can't. Or sometimes we're in situations because we've gotten ourselves into those situations where we're not able. Sometimes it's just simple disobedience. Sometimes it's just a matter of I don't understand it. Or I've come from a different kind of church background and we were never taught this. Some of you are brand new believers and you have no idea what I'm talking about, this whole giving thing. Some of you, just to be honest, don't really care. As long as the lights are on and the chairs are down and you can enjoy it, then you're fine. But it's a biblical principle that we're dealing with here. This isn't John Talley saying, we need your money. Frankly, I don't want it unless you give it in the right way, and it's not coming to me anyway. It's money that we give to the Lord. So we want to see this principle. The Corinthians, just like us, they struggled. And it's an issue that cannot be ignored. Not only for the cause of Christ, the work of Christ that needs to go on here, but for the spiritual well-being of the followers of Christ. And that's what Paul's going to drive home. We're going to see it in later verses that we look at. There's a spiritual dynamic. There's a spiritual blessing. There's a spiritual benefit that comes when we live in obedience in this kind of way. And in a sense, we are robbing God and we're robbing ourselves when we do not participate and follow in obedience in living out the truth of this principle of the work of grace and of God in our lives. So Paul in the next few chapters 8 and 9, is going to lay out these principles for biblical giving to correct some of the misunderstandings that the Corinthians had and the misunderstandings that frankly we have, and to call us all to live with integrity in our giving and to the Lord and to His work. So that's what we're going to look at over these next few weeks together. And so this morning our focus is going to be just on the first 5 verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So with that in mind, with that visual that we have in our mind, listen to what Paul's saying. In a sense, what Paul is saying is there's a few who have stepped forward and there's a lot who haven't. And so here's what we see in verse 1 of chapter 8. Now concerning, I am in 1 Corinthians. See, I've got to get back into the right place. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God, which has been given in the churches of Macedonia. So here's what you hear right away. Paul's talking about the grace of God. That in great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. And this, not as we had expected, but first they gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. And so he goes on and he says, so we urge, and then we'll get into that next week. But those first 5 verses provide for us this beautiful illustration of the principle of the grace work of God in this whole idea of giving. And so the specific illustration of grace giving is given to us in verse 1 and most of verse 2. And Paul recognizes the example, or utilizes this example, of the Macedonian churches. And when you study the book of Acts and other places, you know there was great difficulty and persecution in that area as well. That was where Paul met some of his greatest opposition. And as a matter of fact, that's where we have some of the darkest places as far as the gospel is concerned, even to this day. It's a very difficult area for believers to live out their lives in the open, so to speak. But there was great difficulty even back then. So Paul recognizes this example of God's work of grace in the lives of the Macedonian churches. And he emphasizes the source of their giving is God's grace. This is God's grace work that God has done in their lives, and which has been given to the churches of Macedonia. And so when we talk about giving, making it an obligation really misses the point altogether of what God wants from us. It misses the point, because grace giving is a matter of the heart. It's a matter of the spiritual heart issue, that we understand what God has done for us, and out of this deep appreciation and the enablement that comes from God, we're able to give. Even in our poverty, we're able to give. And that's what Paul points us to. It's an act of God's grace. How are we going to give when we don't have hardly anything? That's why Paul brings up this example. If the Macedonian churches can do it, anyone can do it. Because their experience was so difficult, it made it almost impossible from a human standpoint that they would be able to do this that they've done. But the reason they were able to do it is because God's at work. You see, that's what giving's all about. It's about the work of God in my life. And until we get that principle straight, until we understand that, then giving becomes an obligation, or it becomes a guilt thing that we do. And that's not what God wants. That's not what God's pleased with. I'm sure Pastor Woogie has reminded you of that truth in the last couple of weeks as well. God is not interested in our guilt-ridden activities. What He's interested in is the work of grace of God in our lives, and so that we come out of deep gratitude and in the strength and the empowerment of God. So obligation. For me to get up here and beat you over the head, you need to give more, need to give more. That misses the point of this passage. It misses the whole point of this whole section. Paul wasn't trying to do that, and I have no desire to do that either. All I can share with you is what God's Word says. And I can share from my own personal experience. One of the greatest blessings in my life has come from the opportunities that God has given me to give back to Him. And I've seen over and over and over again, when I have given back to Him, He has given it back to me in ways that I could never imagine. It's a spiritual blessing to be able to do that. And so as we work our way through these passages, I hope you hear that more than anything else. I come to you to preach this passage, one, because we've decided to go through 2 Corinthians, and two, I want you to experience God's blessings in ways that perhaps you haven't been able to because you've walked in disobedience to the principle of God's grace in your life. And you may be sitting there saying, I don't know how I can do it. I'm not sure. I don't have the wherewithal to do that. And that's why this illustration that Paul gives us is so wonderful. Because the Macedonian churches had nothing. Nothing. But what we see is they had one thing very, very important. They had God's grace in their lives, which enabled them to do and fulfill their responsibility in ways that they perhaps thought were not possible. So the recipients of this grace, as we've said in verse 1 here, are the churches there in Macedonia. Now, look at the circumstances in verse 2 as they are given out to us. Their adversity is given to us here. It says this, their circumstances are horrible in one sense. Here it is, that in great ordeal of affliction. And that idea is that they were experiencing great persecution and great difficulty. That's what it's talking about there. So in great ordeal of affliction, he piles on these words, great ordeal, affliction. And when you put all those together, you realize they're in a very difficult situation. So they had great adversity. But then he contrasts that to their great joy. Look at the latter part of verse 2. There it says that in great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy. They couldn't wait, is what we're going to find out. And it says their abundance of joy. And so what I want to say to us here is this. One of the truest indicators of our gratitude to the work of God's grace in our lives is the joy that we have in giving. And I think that's why Paul points this church out. He points them out because they weren't doing it out of obligation. They did it in great joy because they understood that God was giving them the opportunity and they couldn't wait to help. Even though they, in their own circumstances, perhaps needed some help. Perhaps they needed a collection being taken for them. But they couldn't wait to participate to help somebody else. To be involved in the work of God. And that in spite of, in the latter part there of verse 2, in spite of their great poverty. It says their deep poverty there. And so their circumstances are difficult. But in the midst of their circumstances, you see great joy. Now, as I study the New Testament, that contrast is seen over and over again. Think of Paul and Silas in the Philippian jail. As they're thrown in prison, and they're in the middle of the prison, and the way their prison was set up, they were probably sitting on a bar of studs, and their hands are cuffed below the bar, their feet are cuffed below there, and they're just sitting there. They're probably stripped half naked, and they're in a dungeon area, which is dark and it's damp. It's uncomfortable as all get out, and they break out in a worship service. Our financial situation is not the determining factor. It's the grace of God. It's the work of God. And the Macedonians were able to do what they were able to do because they understood that principle. I think the Corinthians were lagging behind because they didn't understand that principle. And sometimes when we are in affluent societies like we are here in America, it gets even more difficult because we're more involved with the pursuit of stuff and having our stuff, and we forget that we really need God's work in our lives. And maybe say it this way, some of the people that were in the larger groups that we had standing up here, some of them may be just giving just because that's what they do. They just give. And that's not what God's talking about here, because it has to be a result of God's grace for God to be pleased with it. And that's what Paul's trying to get across here to us. And so their poverty, their personal financial situation is not the determining factor. They couldn't wait. So what are we saying? What are we saying as we begin this journey through chapters 8 and 9? Well, in verses 3, or the last part of verse 2, all the way down through verse 5, Paul is going to lay out some general principles. He's given a specific illustration. Here's what God did in a work of grace in the Macedonian churches, how in their great ordeal of affliction and poverty, with joy they gave. And now he wants to lay out some principles for us based on this group of churches in Macedonia. And so what I want you to understand here is when we think about grace giving means, what does that mean? When I use the word grace giving, when I talk about it's a work of God, I'm talking about our giving needs to be grace giving. And here's what I think we see in the text. The very last part of chapter 8, verse 2, it says this, that in greater deal of affliction, their abundance of joy, and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. So the first principle that I think is presented here is that when God's grace is at work in our lives and we are operating on the work of grace in our lives, it's going to lead to great generosity. Now, generosity is not determined by the amount because it is a spiritual issue. But what we give and how we give can be measured to a degree. Am I being generous or am I not? Now, how do I want to say that? Here's what I think we need to keep in mind when it comes to this idea of generosity. We should be more concerned about giving as much as we can rather than the minimum of what we can give. All right, that's what works for me. As I try to understand, how do I determine what is generous? Because what may be generous to you may not be generous to me. What may be generous to me may not be generous to you. And so when I'm working through this principle, when God says I'm to be generous, what does that mean? Well, what that means to me is that I'm more concerned about how much I can give rather than what's the minimum that I'm supposed to give. And I think a lot of Christians operate on the minimal activity and the minimal mindset. Okay, what's the least that I can give and still not get God mad at me? Well, that's foolish. That's foolish thinking because God's going to be looking at our hearts. And when we're trying to figure out what's the least amount that I can give to a God who's done everything for me, that's just crazy thinking. A God who's given generously to us should be somebody that we want to give back generously. What does that mean? Well, it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And some of us may be like the widow and we may be able to give just a penny. And if we give that penny and it's the best, it is the most generous thing that we can give, God's pleased with that. Some of us could give a whole lot more. And if we're giving a lot more than everybody else, and I keep going through all the statistics, trust me, I've done all the spreadsheets and the analysis, and none of it really matters. Because we're talking about our hearts. How are we approaching our giving to the Lord? How are we approaching our service to the Lord? Are we seeking to do what's the minimum? Or are we seeking to do whatever we can to give the most? That follows on another principle in the first part of verse 3. He says this, "For I testify that according to their ability, they gave their ability and beyond their ability." And here I pick up the principle of sacrificially. Not only were they generous, they were sacrificial. They gave in their ability. Their ability may have been this much, but they went above their ability and they gave beyond their ability. They gave sacrificially. Well, what does that mean? Well, here's what I think we need to understand. I think that we need to understand that grace giving calls for sacrifices to be made in order for us to give generously. Frankly, we live with a lot. And we've gotten used to living with a lot. After being in the Philippines for 3 weeks, I could not wait to be where I could be connected with Wi-Fi in a way that it would allow me to, it was driving me crazy. I'm trying to take care of my Liberty Online class, and I'd start to download something and it'd crash, and I'm sitting in a carport. Those of you who went on the missions trip with us to the Philippines 2 years ago, we all sat out by the ping pong table. We were able to, all that Wi-Fi is gone. You only have one little Wi-Fi, and they got this bamboo pole that goes up, and they got this little metal receiver on the top of it that grabs a signal from the tower that brings it down to a distributor of the Wi-Fi so that all the people in the office can use it, and it just keeps getting slower and slower and slower and slower. And I was talking to the director and saying, it would be really nice if we could have a better connection. He goes, yeah, well, this is the way it is. Drove me crazy. We're used to having that instant access. We're used to having a lot of these things. Sacrifice means that we're willing to give up some of those things in order that we might be generous. We're not good at giving up stuff. We're not. We're not good at doing that, and so we struggle with the generosity thing because we struggle with the sacrifice thing. Notice what else he says in verse 3. I testify according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord. Here Paul's talking about voluntarily. It's not a matter of guilt. They voluntarily gave. And what's the principle here? The principle here is that we give because we love God and His work and count it a privilege to be a part of it. That's what these people, they could not wait. They considered it a great privilege to be able to be a part, even if it was a small part. Then look at verse 4. It goes on. They gave generously, they gave sacrificially, they gave voluntarily. But then in verse 4, we hear that they gave enthusiastically. Look at this. Begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. They begged. Please give us the opportunity. Now, what happens in the average church today, as we look at the statistics tell us that the average church person, the average Christian in America today, gives less than 2% of their income to the Lord, or just around 2%. In New England, we give barely over 1%. We're in the top 10 of states as far as our greediness, to use it. Now, we are great on the volunteering end, but when it comes to our charitable giving, we are right down at the bottom. Every time you do the statistical analysis, and they do this, every time you look at the wealth index, New Hampshire is in the top 10 of the wealth index, and as far as charitable giving, they're down around 50. So we live in a ourselves to the Lord first. God, we're yours. Here's what we have. Take it and use it for your glory. It's like the little boy with the loaves and the fishes. He didn't have much when you compared to the great need that was out there. But God took it and used it. Now you have to stop and think about that. Jesus Christ, who could turn stones. Visited that, and we spent a day there, and then we spent a day relaxing and got ready to come back, which was a good thing because we got stuck in New York City. Made our trip longer. But nonetheless, we were there. And there were a couple of situations and circumstances that we were in where we had this, do we give a tip or do we don't give a tip? Giving tips in foreign countries is always a tricky thing. Trying to figure out what's appropriate, what's not. I don't want to be offensive, but at the same time, I don't want to be foolish. So we had several conversations with people as we were getting ready to go to Manila and say, okay, what do we do? We're going to have to get a cab here. We're going to have to do this. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to do this? And trying to figure it all out. And in one sense, it was just stressful. I don't want to offend in the culture. And I don't want to be seen as the greedy American. I don't want any of that kind of stuff. And I'm trying to figure all this out. And there was one particular moment where I was getting a little anxious because we were getting ready to do something. I'm trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? It was at one of those moments, all of a sudden this passage came back to me and all the things that I knew that I would be sharing here. And I just stopped and I asked myself this question. How much time do I figure out or spend trying to figure out? How am I going to glorify God? What am I going to do to make Him happy in my giving? You see, I think we spend sometimes more time trying to figure out how much we give into a tip. And the average person gives far more in a tip than they give to the Lord. And I think we end up being hurt by that. Because it is a spiritual issue. It's a matter of God's grace in our lives. God has called us to live with integrity in the way that we give. The Macedonians got it. The Corinthians eventually get it. The question this morning is, do we? Let's pray. Our Father and our God, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for the opportunity that we have to look at this passage of Scripture. We recognize that it covers a subject that is difficult for us. It can be a struggle for us at times to recognize the truth of what you're saying, but trying to figure out how to deal with our circumstances.